Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Andrew Rosen. I lead the integrated evidence function at Moderna, and I'm very excited to be presenting on clinician engagement in the era of data-driven medicine and some new technologies and capabilities. The perspectives I share are my own and don't necessarily reflect those of Moderna. So I'd like to begin by sharing a perspective. And that is that medical affairs is the bridge, and it's the bridge in a number of different ways. We serve at this critical juncture between clinicians and patients and our industry. We're bringing forward critical information about the efficacy and safety of our drugs, about the latest in the disease state, and we're gathering critical perspectives, insights from the clinicians about patient care back into our industry, into our teams to sharpen our approach. How can we provide more value? We are the bridge between what happens at the laboratory bench and what is implemented at the bedside, taking research and making sure it makes its way to mainstream medicine. We take information that might be blunt and generic, something from a journal or a disease state deck, and we make sure that it's targeted, precise, applicable to a particular situation and person. And then finally, we are the bridge from where we are in medicine to where we need to go. We are enabling the future generation of medicine. So allow me to share what I'd like to present to you today. I want to focus on data-driven strategy. How do we use data and evidence to sharpen our approach to bring more value? I'd like to talk about personalized medicine via data, and I'd like to talk about patient centricity and how we can go further with data and digital technology. All of these things I'll speak about are through the lens of real-world evidence, and I've selected an array of capabilities that I think are of greatest interest and use, and I hope that you consider these things in light of the challenges that you face with your teams, the challenges your clinicians face, the patients are facing, and maybe you'll find something to pull through and experiment with. So to begin, I'd like to talk about dynamic real-world evidence dashboards. And these are your home base. It's your hub. It's the window into the world of the clinicians and patients that you care about. And the dynamic real-world evidence dashboard is comprised of a set of data. It has to be current, it has to be comprehensive, it has to be applicable and accurate to your specific needs. It might relate to electronic medical records, administrative claims data, anything from laboratory sequencing, gene sequencing, through radiographic imaging and electrophysiology. All of this is at your fingertips and ready to be queried and used in novel ways. So you pull these things through into a dashboard, perhaps Tableau, Power BI, something custom, and what you do with this data and the dashboard, there's literally an endless array of possibilities. You might be interested in current trends in mortality. You might be interested in uptake of your drug on a day-by-day basis, adherence, tolerability. How are your patients faring as related to a competitor? In which geography is it has the greatest uptake and coverage? All of these things at your fingertips. Patient journey, clinician practices. A component of the real-world evidence dashboard is a capability called geospatial mapping. And this is quite simple. It's taking that real-world evidence and mapping it geospatially, day by day, zip code by zip code, county by county, seeing what is happening with the clinicians and patients you care about. I worked for several years in rare disease, and one application I could speak to as an example, we were interested in finding people at high risk for this rare disease. So we developed an algorithm and applied that algorithm to the real-world evidence data, and then we mapped it geospatially, and we saw pockets of patients that were at high risk. We couldn't see the patient identities, but you can see the clinician identities should there be a sufficient number of these patients. So instead of blanketing the field in commercial and medical engagement, wherever you can get your foot in the door, the hospitals that you are aware of, the clinicians you have a relationship with, all of that is very subjective. Here you are putting data at the center of your engagement strategy. You know exactly which clinicians to engage with. This supports equity and patient centricity in that you might be focusing on communities that are underserved, and you have an awareness of that via this data. You might use this data in the field. You might galvanize action. If you talk to a physician and you say, there's a risk of this disease, these are the potential symptoms that are high risk, that's one approach. But if you go further and say there are 600 patients within a 3-mile limit radius around your practice that are at high risk based on our algorithm, that might get that physician to think, maybe I actually do have a patient that is at risk of this disease. So much that is possible here. If you're an MSL manager or a commercial manager, this is a unique view of where your colleagues are having interactions. What are the outcomes? You can map genetic testing results if that's something that's part of your strategy. Taking this one step further is the notion of computational phenotyping and alerts. And computational phenotyping is just a big word for developing a mathematical model, a machine learning algorithm, and the purpose is to find a patient type of interest. So it sort of relates to the previous example. It might be a patient at risk of a disease. It might be a patient that would likely derive benefit from a therapy, or a patient that is likely to fail a therapy. It might be a patient that meets the inclusion criteria for a clinical trial, which is critical because we need to get those trials enrolled quickly in order to develop medicines. So to do this, you take the same real-world evidence and working with an internal or external team of data scientists, develop a machine learning model for this patient type of interest. You then apply that model prospectively. So it's not something you're looking into the past, but day by day, you're looking for the incidence of this patient. Should a physician detect and care for a sufficient number of these patients, maybe 10 or more, to obscure their identity, an alert can be sent to your medical team, to your clinical development team. So this allows you to respond exactly at the right time to the right person with the right information. We know exactly when to respond. So it's not a subjective approach, it's a very data-oriented and triggered approach. Another capability that really pushes the envelope is something I call live precision cohorts. And this is a step toward patient centricity. It's a step toward personalized medicine via data. Oftentimes when we hear personalized medicine via data, our mind goes to genetic sequencing, which is incredibly important. But there's also the possibility of using real-world evidence to sharpen and personalize the recommendations for treatment and diagnosis. So live precision cohorts is best described via hypothetical example. You are a medical affairs teammate and you're visiting a physician. The physician has a patient, Mr. Jones, who has solid tumor cancer, stage 2, has failed 1 line of therapy. Mr. Jones is a former smoker. He has a history of congestive heart failure. He lives 100 miles from the nearest academic health center. All of these clinical, demographic, behavioral properties that comprise Mr. Jones. What you won't find in the Lancet, the New England Journal, the NCCN guidelines, is properties that relate to Mr. Jones. You, as a person with a disease, you are not the disease. You are all of those individual properties. So what we could do now, technically, and beginning to implement, is on the spot, create a live cohort of real patients up to the day data. You know, the physicians have the journals, but they don't have access to the aggregated real-world evidence in a way that it could be used. So you now have, on the spot, 240,000 patients that look exactly like Mr. Jones. And you can see, how did they fare on treatment A, treatment B, treatment C? What happened when you delay treatment? What happens when you administer treatment? Do they tolerate it? Do they adhere to it? How much does it cost? All of this can be used to inform the approach to treatment. And what's critical is this is an opportunity to give agency to the patient. Let them go beyond just trusting in their physician, but knowing how much benefit am I likely to derive here? 6 months of survival, 12, 2 years? What side effects will I suffer based on not just the disease overall and the medicine overall, but my properties? What is the cost? So you can use all this real-world evidence from the physician side and the patient side to make a data-driven, informed decision. This all relates to the emergence of artificial intelligence models in mainstream medicine, and this is literally exploding. Over the last 5 years, we now have an FDA approval pathway for these types of AI ML software as medical devices. There are over 500 approvals of these devices. About 2/3 of them are in radiology, but they span neurology, cardiology, radiology, psychiatry. They're used for things like triage, diagnosis, or even the treatment itself could be an AI ML device. So this is incredibly important. It is the future of medicine to combine the conventional approaches to treatment with the more data-driven technology that is now available, and medical affairs can bridge that transition, ensure that we are continuing to provide value. The last capability I want to discuss is something called digital twins. And this is also another step toward personalized medicine and patient centricity. Digital twins is something that's very exciting. It has applications across a number of different industries. You'll find it in aeronautics, in manufacturing, in the biotechnology industry. It has many different definitions, but for our purposes, the digital twin is using real-world evidence to create a mathematical model that reflects a patient's health, and more specifically, can predict the time course of that health. How will they progress with their disease? How will they progress on a well-known therapy for which we have data available? So the most significant use case here is putting this toward clinical trials. We can do clinical trials faster, with less money and more patient centricity, getting drugs available quicker and available to the clinicians and patients that need them. Unlearn is one company that's advancing these solutions. What is worse than being diagnosed with a severe, fatal, perhaps, disease? Learning that the best option for you is to go into a clinical trial, and then further to find out that you've been randomized to a placebo group. At this point, it's necessary, but it's absolutely awful. We can reduce the number of patients in placebo arms in certain disease states in trials by up to 50%. And the FDA is on board with this approach. So cheaper medical trials, more patient centricity, fewer patients on placebo, medicines delivered to patients faster. It's the future. So we talked about data-driven strategy, the real-world evidence dashboard, the geospatial mapping. We talked about computational phenotyping and live precision cohorts and how that can sharpen the approach to tailoring a course of therapy for a patient and give them agency to use data to make a choice. We also talked about digital twins and how we can lessen the burden on patients to be in placebo arms and get therapies available faster. So I really do hope that you found this at the very least interesting and hopefully useful. There might be applications to your team. In conclusion, medical affairs is critical, as well as other partners in the industry, to see this change in medicine to a data-driven approach, to take the old guard of medicine and combine it with real-world evidence, digital technology, artificial intelligence. It is an incredibly exciting time to be part of this industry and to see this transition in medicine, but to continue to provide value, we have to go beyond the therapy to make sure that this change happens. So thank you very much. I would like to take questions. I think we have a few minutes, or Darius, should we move forward? Maybe one or two questions if there are. If not, we'll move on. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. And do you know if any governmental body or states interested in this approach? Because again, I encourage everyone to adopt this approach, and I believe in its future. But again, other than approval of these standards, do you know maybe there is some interest from state bodies to this?
The capability that I mentioned that's probably most applicable to your question is digital twins, because we're talking about clinical trials, and we really do have to partner with FDA and EMA. Companies like Unlearn are having those discussions, and it seems that FDA and EMA are very open to this approach. It is mathematically rigorous. They are fully on board with reducing the burden on patients and to get medicines delivered faster. But there are limitations, of course. I could probably talk for an hour about just digital twins, but there's also tremendous possibility and a need to get fewer patients on placebo. Yes?
Sorry, thank you for a great talk. One thing that I was wondering would be interesting with this modeling is the area of organoids, for example, are used in cancers and CF and other diseases, which can help also see what treatments might be effective. And I'm thinking, I wonder if that would also be interesting to combine with the algorithms as well to even strengthen somewhat that information, right? Because it's still very personalized. It's the patient's tissue in that mock organ that's like mapping that out. I'm curious, have you guys looked at that as well?
Not personally, but I do personally find it fascinating, and I think the digital twins that I'm showing are reflective just of clinical records. So mostly EHR and lab reports and claims data. Going a step further and including sequencing data, proteomics, transcriptomics, I think could only bring exponential value to how tailored we can get, how predictive and sensitive our models are. So I do think that's the path. Many things need to fall into place, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it makes
Michelle.
sense. It's on the left-hand side, isn't it? It's really part of that clinical workup, so it makes sense.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.